Hi folks, I'm going to deal with this week's topic in two different parts. So we're going to deal with a little bit of background on evolution and genetics, hopefully most of which will be review for you folks. And then I'll do a second part where we'll look more specifically at how these understandings apply to our contemporary understanding of human biological variation and race. And then in following weeks, we're going to revisit evolutionary theory as we look at our closest living relatives, non-human primates. We'll look a little bit at primate evolution, and then we'll spend the remainder of the term looking at human evolution. So again, before we get to there though, we should probably do a little bit of review. So evolution is one of these foundational theories in anthropology as a discipline, right? And it informs a lot of our understandings of not only human biological variation, but just human variation in general. And remember that when we apply the anthropological perspective, one of our goals is going to be to treat humans holistically, right? And so this means that we have to recognize that humans are biocultural organisms. So one of the things you'll see when we talk about human biological variation is that we have to consider the role that culture plays in transforming our species, in shaping our experiences and shaping our populations as well. So evolution is very important then because it provides us the framework, right? It provides us the core concepts that allow us to not only understand human variation, but also understand our origin. And you'll remember that these are two of our major goals if we go all the way back to the beginning of the term of our course themes. So the other thing I kind of want to mention right off the bat is that, again, because a lot of these concepts are going to be that might have popped up in some of your other courses and coursework, I don't do a comprehensive overview, right? My goal is to focus on kind of key ideas that you do need to know moving forward should you take other anthropology classes, or moving forward to address our other topics for the remainder of the term. So evolution then is one of the most important theories in anthropology, right? It's not anthropological in origin. Anthropology is a relatively recent discipline compared to other ones, right? And of course, evolutionary theory has also informed other fields of studies quite significantly as well. So some key points about evolutionary theory, right? And recall back when we talked about, at the beginning of the term, when we talked about anthropology as a science, we talked about how we define theories, right, under scientific method. And the key thing is that the reason why evolutionary theory is so foundational in anthropology, is so important in anthropology, is because it's something that we have been able to test, right, time and time again. And we are able to do this using our evidence from the fossil record, as we'll see, but we can also see it in action in living populations as well, not only human ones, but non-human populations as well. It's a unified theory, and this can mean a number of different things to different people. But how I understand unified is that it is something that is consistent across disciplines. It is something that, while it has been adapted and changed as we have new methods and technologies to, again, test evolutionary theory, the major principles have been upheld and maintained the same. And then it's also fruitful, and I think this is really important, and it kind of sparkens back to just kind of scientific endeavors and inquiries in general, is that, again, through this testing, we have been able to come to a number of other different kinds of conclusions, and it's been so productive in terms of informing us about the universe around us, right? And specifically for anthropology, about the human experience, both very specifically and both very generally. So so you'll notice here that I actually have unified defined as it also explains a wide variety of material evidence as well, right? So it's not just fossil evidence, but this combination of evidence from living populations as well. And the material evidence that we use, as you'll see when we specifically talk about human evolution and primate evolution, is a constantly changing and developing data set as well, right? We are consistently finding new pieces to the puzzle that is human and primate evolution overall as well. Okay. So there's a lot of, when we think about evolutionary theory, of course, the key figure that we think of here in the West is Charles Darwin, right? And yes, we're going to get to him, but Darwin didn't come up with evolutionary theory on his own, as we'll talk about. What's really important to me when we look at these, kind of take these historical perspectives on how theory is developed, is to look at other philosophers, other scientists, other naturalists, biologists, etc., explorers, right, who contributed to our understanding. And so a lot of these pre-Darwinian views here in the West go back to kind of the classical philosophers of thought. So people like Plato and Aristotle, who were simply attempting to just order nature, right? So to find ways of discussing and describing and categorizing the natural world they saw around them, of which humans were just one piece, right? And I think that's an important tradition that comes from these early thinkers in Western thought, is that, again, it's kind of holistic in approach, right? That humans were just seen as, again, one part of life on the planet, and many of these systems, these early systems of ordering nature, incorporated not only living components, plants, other animals, but also inorganic components as well, attempting to, again, explain not just life on the planet, but the planet itself and the broader universe, more broadly speaking. So some of the early ideas that inspired and informed people like Darwin were things like essentialism. And in particular, evolutionary theory was kind of a contrast to this. A lot of essentialist theories argue that, it's kind of like deterministic theory as well, right? Argue that there is an unchanging essence or nature to living creatures. So there is something that makes a dog, there's something that makes a human, and those things that make a dog, and a human are unique to us as species, as beings, right? And this is what separates us and keeps us distinct and different, right? And so some of these early inquiries were attempting to understand, well, what is it that makes a dog, and a human? Why are we so different? Right? And those questions would come later through the application of those answers would come later through evolutionary theory. From this idea that there's this kind of core essence that represents what organisms are, a key part of this as well was this idea that they were also unchanging, right? That they were kind of fixed or static. And other theories, pre-Darwinian views that influenced Darwin, again, often that he was in critique of, was ideas around, again, this idea of fixity or staticness of species itself, right? And again, religious ideologies later on would heavily influence this as well, arguing that, that we were created by a supernatural being, right? A God, a creator, and as such, we were, our essence, our being was fixed at this point of creation, and that we were unchanging over time, right? So this kind of key counterpoint to evolutionary theory. And of course, evolutionary theory argues the opposite, that indeed we have changed and are changing as species, and this is just part of the natural process of things, right? So another piece of these early models and these early thoughts in terms of ordering nature were very hierarchical based. So there was this kind of understanding that we could order, and again, this kind of mirrored political and economic structures at the time, that we could kind of order all of life into these single graded continuums of, again, all life on Earth. And again, and some of these great chains of being later on would even incorporate inorganic elements, and some even incorporated supernatural elements. So again, in the Dark Ages, we see the great chain of being incorporating, from Catholicism and Christianity more broadly, things like God, but also things like angels and demons and other supernatural beings and forces. So now let's skip forward a couple of millennia and let's look at some key other scientific thoughts that informed Darwin. And of course, the work of Carolus Linnaeus is some of the most important work in terms of influencing how, again, we order and classify the world around us. So he was a Swedish naturalist who was known for his contributions to the system of classification, taxonomy, that we still use today. And again, I'm just going to provide a brief overview of this. I don't want to emphasize this too much, because you'll have chances if you go on to take like our biological anthropology class to get more into some of the nitty gritty. So again, I'm just trying to provide a very brief summary, kind of cherry-picked overview of some of these key figures and some of their contributions. So we use taxonomy as a mechanism to, again, assign organisms to a particular category, to a taxon. And again, most of you will have been exposed to this at the very minimum in a high school biology class, and many of you have engaged in higher levels of discourse around taxonomy and biological binomial nomenclature. So the naming system that we use, that again is derived from the original one that was developed by Linnaeus, in your other kinds of courses, particularly courses like biology, right? And so the key thing of this was not only to provide groups, right, or taxons that we could sort life and living organisms into, but also would provide unique names for those living organisms, for plants and animals, right? So each plant and animal would be provided with a higher genus level name and a lower species level name, and with a single genus containing a multitude of various species within it, right? So Linnaeus is simply, what his major contribution was a system, right, for ordering nature. So early thinkers provided us with ways of thinking about and considering the variation that they were seeing in the world around them. Linnaeus said, well, we need to provide some structure about this, right? And also think about this in terms of the growing scholarship and communication that was going on in this period, was also avoiding things like repetition, right? If you'd already, so-and-so had already classified this particular plant with this particular name, and then someone else identified it, how do we know if they're the same or not? How do we kind of, again, keep track and order and organize all of these different kinds of things? Note that for some of these figures, I provide things like dates, the key volumes of work. So his system of taxonomy, the use of binomial nomenclature, was formalized in his book Systema Naturae in 1735. I call this the kind of Jeopardy trivia types of things, right? And because, as you'll see, the exams are going to have short answer questions on this versus, just kind of fact memorization. This is useful information to know because it provides context. It kind of fleshes out the lived experience of these individuals who contributed to evolutionary theory, but again, it's not necessarily things I expect you to memorize or reproduce on an exam. But this was one of the key books that would influence later thinkers like Darwin. What's interesting about Linnaeus is that he actually was a proponent of the idea of the fixity of species. He argued strongly for, again, the fact that organisms were reflective of what they were at the point of created, and that they were at the point of creation, and that they did not change over time. However, in later versions, this is something that he reflected back on and started to change, hinting at the possibility that indeed some species, but not all, may have been related to others because of common descent. And the reason why I mention that is important as well is just to show that being self-critical of one's own ideas, revising work based on new evidence, is good scientific method, right? So the fact that he later started to question his own kind of rigid adherence to fixity of species is, in my opinion, the mark of a good scientist versus a flaw of his original ideas, right? He reassessed it and revised his conclusions on the basis of that. Great science. Okay. Then we have at the same time, and I don't mention them in here, and I believe your textbook does talk about them, a whole swackload of people who are also thinking about change, not just change in organisms, but change in things like landforms. So we have people like Hutton and Hooke and Cuvier and Lyell who are looking at other processes in the natural world around, specifically changes in like landforms, geological processes, change in the surface of the earth, change in the seasons, the climate, etc. So all of these kind of what we might call non-living components of our experience or of our existence of our planet, in order to reinforce their theories and some of their ideas. So, and thanks to the work of people like Hutton and Cuvier and Lyell, we now have an understanding again of some of these critical processes of landforms changing over time that was used as other evidence to support, well, that if the surface of our planet is changing fundamentally, constantly, that likely the organisms living on its surface would also be impacted as well. So We also then start to have other people who are not focused so much on classifying and ordering, but attempting to understand the relationships between various organisms, and also attempting to understand why organisms change. So not everyone was focused on fixity of species, and Comte de Buffon is one of these key figures. And so what we see in the 1700s, as you'll see a lot of these key figures, is that a handful of scientists, naturalists, researchers, academics, were starting to argue that, contrary to, again, religious doctrine, that organisms were not fixed, that they changed over time, and sometimes that this could happen in very dramatic conditions. And so the four scientists that we're going to look at are, as I mentioned, Comte de Buffon, but also Lamarck, of course Darwin, and Alfred Wallace. So Georges Louis Leclerc Comte de Buffon, I always have to look up his name, was a French naturalist, mathematician, and biologist. I'll also mention that I think part of the reason why we have so many kind of big thinkers at this time, at least from a European tradition, is because of the extensive interdisciplinary training that these guys had. And so he studied plants and animals, and what he started to notice was that different plants and animals in different areas look differently, right? And what he essentially had identified is that we have this dynamic relationship that exists between species and their physical environments. And so in his book, Natural History, published in 1749, he stressed the importance of change in our universe and in the changing nature of species of organisms. He believed that when organisms moved to new areas, when they migrated to new regions, to new environments, they gradually became different, altered, they changed in response to what we now know as adaptation to that different environment. Now, he did reject the idea that one species could give rise to another. So again, none of these guys are perfect. All of them are using the data that they had on hand. But his recognition of the role that environment played is really critical to our understanding. Now, Lamarck is probably a figure that most of you are more familiar with. He is also a French naturalist. His proper name is Jean-Baptiste de Monet, but he is best known by his title Chevalier de Lamarck. And he speculated that not only do plants and animals change over time, but do so for the mechanism of self-improvement. And you can see, those of you familiar with Darwin's theory of natural selection know that this is a critical idea, right? The idea that species were not only changing in response to environmental conditions, but to their advantage. And so this was a key thing. So essentially what his argument was that is if our external environment changes and animals' activity patterns also change to accommodate those new circumstances, right? Now, he argued that these, in particular, physical changes would occur as a result of changes in, again, circumstance in the environment around them. And so basically that there'd be a need that would arise in result of a change in environment, and that this need would trigger fluids and forces within the organism that would cause that particular body part or whatever is needed to adapt and change. So his mechanism for evolution was wrong, but his underlying principle was correct, right? And particularly this idea of adaptation. And a lot of people talk about Lamarck's giraffes, and so I had to, of course, include one of my photos of giraffes. Immediately after taking, or as I was taking this photo, this giraffe went from eating leaves and demonstrating what I was trying to show here to just looking at the camera. They just love attention like this. But this is what we're seeing here, right, is this idea that initially we have these short-necked ancestor giraffes, basically that what the force, the selective pressure that they needed to adapt to was that the most choice leaves were located in higher branches, and so they'd be stretching up to reach them. Again, these forces and fluids within the organism would be triggered, and over the course of this individual's lifetime, they would see a change in their anatomy. This trait would then be passed down on to their offspring. So again, some of this is correct, but the mechanism that he had was incorrect, that these changes do not occur in an individual's lifetime, like in an individual's organism, but the inheritance of these traits is a key thing, right? In particular, the selection for particular traits was on point and on track. So now we get into the heavy hitters, and the key thing with these folks is that they're familiar with the work that was going on beforehand, and indeed we're in communication even with each other. So while we think of evolution by natural selection as kind of explicitly linked with Charles Darwin, it's also very strongly strongly connected with Wallace. And I always argue that the reason why we focus on Darwin and not Wallace has a lot to do with class bias in Western European thought. Darwin was a man of means who came from an accomplished, respected family. Wallace, on the other hand, was basically almost like a merchant sailor who went on expeditions and took his observations he made while traveling the globe and communicated them with folks like Darwin. And then Darwin was able to beat basically Wallace to the punch and publish his work previous to that. So what's interesting is that this isn't a case of scientific plagiarism, but they both had the same ideas, developed independently. One just got a bit more media attention and as such is associated with it. And again, the key thing with both of them is that they're attempting to explain, much like the earliest philosophers did, the variation that they were seeing in nature. So again, in the notes below, I give you a bit of background on both Darwin and Wallace and some of their histories and some of the trips that they and voyages that they went on that influenced them and their ideas. I always joke that personally, if I had a choice between two boats, the Beagle and the Mischief, I would choose the Mischief any sort of day. But you can see here that his key article in 1859 predates Darwin's On the Origin of Species by Natural Selection by a year. So again, and letters between the two document that they were having quite a bit of communication on this. I also think that just the way that Darwin captured how natural selection works and the language that he used was something that was just very clear, logical, well received, picked up, and go from there. And actually, I'll read a little bit of Darwin's work in class to you folks this week. So this is a classic image that's used that just kind of counterpoints, shows the counterpoint between Lamarck and Darwinian view. And you see, again, there's just kind of slight variations. That with Darwin's view, what we have is that we have, rather than focusing on individual, we focus on populations or groups of organisms. And what we see is that, again, environmental factors or other selective pressures favor those individuals with the longer, in this case, the trunk, right? And that this favored trait is going to allow this organism the ability to more readily survive and persist in their environment, and therefore pass on their preferred trait, or the preferred trait or the selected for trait in their particular environment. And what this would result in then is over time is a preference towards elephants with longer trunks. So these are the major principles that define evolution by natural selection, and we'll go over these more in class. And the other thing I would like you folks to do, and we'll talk a little bit this a bit more, is how his 8 principles of evolution kind of boil down into these 3 key things: that A, variation exists; that B, these variations can be transmitted through the practice of heredity. He didn't know what the mechanism was. It was thanks to oh my goodness, to Mundell that we would understand how genetics worked, right? How traits could be transmitted from parents to offspring, but also that different variants leave and result in different numbers on the offspring, right? That again, that there is a diverse pool of resources or traits that can be selected from, and which traits are selected for dependent on, again, what the selective pressures are. So I'm not going to go too much into genetics. Again, if you're unfamiliar with some of the basic genetic principles, your textbook provides an excellent overview. But again, I just wanted to highlight that, Mendelian genetics was some of the earliest theories and earliest work that was used to explain and provide that mechanism for inheritance. However, we now know that not all inheritance is Mendelian based as well. But again, that's for higher level course, right? So I just want you folks to refresh yourself on some of the key principles that he derived relating to how traits are inherited. And again, later on, we're going to apply and think about these in terms of both primate and human evolution. So that's the key thing. The last thing I want to mention is that in recent times, under what we call the modern synthesis, where we see now genetic theory and early Darwinian theory applied together, is that we now look at evolution from kind of 2 major ways. So yes, we can look at changes that occur in one species over time, or microevolution, but in our course, we're actually going to focus more on macroevolution, or the changes that led to diversification in the number of species and result in some conditions, the rise of new species. So when we focus again on primate and human evolution, that's what we're going to be focusing on. However, when we talk about race and racism, microevolution, so variation within our species, is what we're going to be focusing on. So again, I've provided you with a bit of context on the modern evolutionary synthesis, some of the key ideas and principles that we use to understand this. And again, most of this I'm hoping is review for you folks, so please do take a look at this. One of the key principles I do want you to think about and consider, because we'll be talking about this a lot, and again, this video is starting to run a little long, so I'm just going to try to wrap this up here, and so we'll revisit on this next one, relates to that one of the things that microevolution has demonstrated consistently is that most variation in traits is clinal. So what does this mean is that there's a gradual shift in phenotypes or the expression of genotypes between populations over space, and this is reflective of allele frequency changes and the various mechanisms that drive these changes. And so what this means is that there's actually few sharp borders between traits in human populations. Now, this is important because often racial classification systems challenge this notion, right? So they kind of argue that there isn't clinal variation in humans, that there are discrete categories that we can place humans into based on patternings of traits. And what you're going to see is that that's false, that cannot be supported by what we know about allele frequencies, about phenotypes, about genotypes, about the distribution of traits within populations. Okay. So the video that we're going to talk about, so please do take a chance to watch this before class on Wednesday, relating to microevolution, talks about the 5 fingers of evolution. We can talk about the example of one of the classic examples of sickle cell anemia, and like I said, macroevolution we'll deal with a bit later on in the course. And so the 5 fingers of evolution actually goes over these processes quite well and incorporates one additional one. So on Wednesday, come prepared to talk about these things. Again, we will go over some various examples of some of these different processes, and then later on in the term we're going to look at how these apply to our understanding of human evolution, and then how do we go from understanding human variation and microevolution to understanding macroevolutionary process and the rise and the origin of our species. So take care, everyone, and I will see you in class soon.